Hey, I'm Luke, and today we're talking about Mage Errant by Bierce. I'm going to start off with a quick, no-spoiler case for why I think you should give this series a shot if you haven't already, and then I'm going to open things up to spoilers and dive into what I think makes the series just really uniquely interesting. Seriously, I probably would have passed on Mage Errant as just yet another YA progression series if my wife hadn't been so insistent that it might be her new favorite series. And I'm really glad that I gave it a chance. It's absolutely fantastic. If you're new to my channel, then welcome. If you're a fan of literature, then I think you're really going to like what I'm doing here, and I hope you'll also check out my series on the Wheel of Time. If you're one of my regulars, then thanks for sticking with me as I finally move past Robert Jordan. If you watched my last video, you're probably wondering what the plan is going forward. In brief, I plan on making a full video documenting the very real hell my wife, Bailey, and I are going through with her cancer, both to help anyone else that might be going through the same thing, and just because it's a really bizarre and unique situation that I honestly really could not have foreseen before living through it myself. And as depressing as it is, I'd really like to share this awful feeling and situation with other people just out of novelty. I don't know, maybe it'll inspire you to write something. In any case, I feel like not a lot of people are in this position, and I almost feel like it's my duty to try to share it so at least some good can come of it. Beyond that, I'm going to continue making videos on literature, but I'm setting aside all the stuff I talked about in the last video so I can focus on reading books that Bailey loves instead. Under the circumstances, I think that's fair. Lucky for you, she has excellent taste, so next up is Sanderson's Cosmere. But today is all about Mage Errant, so let's get to it, starting with the no-spoiler review. Okay, so Mage Errant is the second series I've chosen to discuss on this channel. The Wheel of Time was the first. I may have chosen Mage Errant simply because my wife really wanted me to read it, but it's my good fortune that this works out perfectly to illustrate a point I've actually been thinking about a lot lately. So the classification of fiction is a really tricky topic, rife with kind of bizarre abstract bias. At the top level, we have the distinction between literary and genre fiction. Then within genre fiction, we have the two great categories of science fiction and fantasy. To say that the categories get messy and ill-defined from here would imply that we're not already well over our heads in ambiguity and classism. Debating whether a work is or isn't cyberpunk, for example, is about as tumultuous as debating subgenres of metal and music. In the most general sense, what we're trying to do here is to sort things into groups. And if we're well adjusted, we don't really care too much about perfection, but in just getting a general sense of what is or isn't relevant for a specific purpose. One way to group things is via classes. There are a bunch of definitions of class, but for our purposes, a class is a grouping of things and sets of things that share a defining property. So books, series of books, and entire subgenres. Everything that has this defining property is in the class, and everything that lacks it is not in the class. Naively, incorrectly, we might say, for example, that any story with dragons is fantasy, and any story involving space is science fiction. So The Hobbit is fantasy, Ender's Game is science fiction, and The Dragon Riders of Pern is both, although it leans more towards the fantasy aesthetic. If your story is about a disillusioned SpaceX employee who sees their employer as a dragon, with readers left to debate the extent to which the protagonist's conception of the world is literal, metaphorical, or insane, then it's properly literary fiction. Of course, the system doesn't actually work all that well. Take a genre like isekai. We can all agree that Konosuba counts, right? How about .hack? Unlike Konosuba, .hack does not take its video game-like world for granted, instead specifically focusing on and deconstructing the playing of video games as a core element of the entire franchise. How about A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court? This is technically time travel rather than travel between worlds, and the story doesn't feel at all like the recent slew of very anime isekai, but it does have a character entering a world foreign to him, retaining full memory of the world he came from, and using his knowledge of the real world to gain ever more extreme advantages within the world he finds himself in. How about Alice's Adventures in Wonderland? Again, probably not what anyone's thinking of when they ask for an isekai recommendation, but I often see Urashima-ko listed as the first isekai, and I don't really feel like Urashima's adventures come off as more isekai than Hank Morgan's or Alice's. We may as well say that Love Hina's tongue-in-cheek retelling of Urashima-ko as a slice-of-life harem is isekai. Love Hina's Urashima does, after all, enter a world entirely foreign to him, one populated by attractive women who are inexplicably attracted to him, with escapades ever growing in absurdity. Or if we're considering Akamatsu's other work, maybe Mao Sensei Negima is the better isekai example. That one actually has a fantasy world, magic spells, and various hierarchies of power. Still, it doesn't feel much like any of the recent isekai light novel series or anime, so it really doesn't seem like our defining property is doing its job here. If someone asked me for an isekai recommendation, I think Slayers would actually be a better example than any of these others, but Slayers utterly lacks the essential property of an isekai work. None of the perspective characters traveled to their world from ours. We could attempt to refine our definition, but try it for yourself. There's really no easy way to choose a set of properties that actually accomplishes what we want here. Either something relevant will be left out or something irrelevant will sneak in. Rather than trying to define our genres based on a property of the text, we could organize things socially and subjectively. If all you want is a story similar to Konosuba, then just define a grouping of books like Konosuba, according to fans of the work. Or flip the whole relationship around and just look for favorite lists from people with tastes similar to your own. This brings us to the other main method of grouping things. Rather than defining membership in the group by a common property, just make a list explicitly. A title is in the set if you put it there, and it isn't if you didn't. If someone asks why a work isn't in the list and you can't think of a good reason, then just add it in. This is less scalable, but this solution has the benefit of actually making sense in most cases. If you want to be technical, a set defined by a rule is intentional, a set defined by a full list of elements is extensional, and a set defined by giving some examples to extrapolate from is ostensive. Alright, so that's almost enough tangent. Let's start to move back towards Mage Errant. Now, Mage Errant has dragons and magic, and any technology is explained in terms of said magic. The magic system is more rooted in real science than in most fantasy settings, and the metaphysics are relatively consistent and realistic in universe compared to other, more mysterious forms of fantasy magic. But at least in terms of superficial ambience, Mage Errant really feels like fantasy. Throughout the series, we watch our characters grow in power immensely, with hints at ever more extreme forms of power and even mentions of a path to godhood, which can be obtained through a combination of physical training, magical training, and a more nebulous focus on identity. The characters are teens and they're students at a magic school. The magic of Mage Errant is very powerful, and there's little attention to historical realism. This is not Earth in the past in the age of mythical swords and sorcery. This is a different place altogether. So if you add everything up, we have a Western Shenxia epic fantasy magic school story. And maybe that's sufficient. I mean, atmosphere does matter to a story. We have different tastes and moods. Nebulous as they are, genre is useful for picking something to suit a mood. But, and here's where we're finally getting to my point, I'd argue that the greater distinction, or at least as significant of a distinction, between types of literature is the intent, the type of message being conveyed. If I were to define the essential difference between science fiction and fantasy as I see it, I'd say that it's this. Fantasy teaches us something essential, ubiquitous about ourselves as human beings. Appealing to ancient cultural stories and our imagined ancestors is merely an effective method of showing us something that was true about people in the past, is true about people today, and will remain true about people in the future. Fantasy is metaphor. We map the struggles of our fantasy heroes against dragons and demons to our personal experiences with exams, projects, relationships, layoffs, diagnoses, etc. Fantasy heroes are generally better than real people, not just in terms of ability, but in virtue. Despite their heroic abilities, they still suffer and toil as we do, yet they handle themselves as we'd like to think that we would in a similar situation. If our heroes were able to pick themselves back up after losing their mentors, stay true to their quests even when hope seems lost, and ultimately slay their dragons and demons despite all odds, then perhaps we can find just a little bit of that courage and grace for ourselves. This definition even fits for the purpose of many of our myths going back far in time. They were meant to teach the audience about themselves and how they fit into the world. The specific details about how the gods relate to one another did matter. People generally tend to believe their religions fairly literally. But it was still about teaching something timeless and universal, at least to a specific culture group. Not generally about making a topical political point through analogy. Even when taken literally, stories of the gods and heroes were also meant to teach life lessons, inspire the audience, and serve as an example of the virtue of a culture group. Science fiction, on the other hand, is a call to action for society. It's an argument, made by analogy and metonym. Weyland Yutani isn't a metaphor for companies like Amazon. It is Amazon, with just a few more acquisitions and a bit more lobbying. Science fiction is almost inherently topical and political. Sci-fi stories don't merely show us what the future may be for the fun of it. We're meant to consider whether this is the future we want or whether we should fight to change or else guarantee it. Sci-fi characters aren't necessarily any different from us, and they might even be a lot worse, even the heroes. We're meant to empathize with the situations they find themselves in and consider what we do in their shoes more than we're meant to idolize them as personal heroes. Whether a work is genre or literary fiction is a bit more complex, and I think this distinction actually hides some more meaningful dimensions. First, does the work build upon tropes of an existing genre of fiction, or does it aim to be more universal? Generally speaking, literary fiction is often set in a realistic setting, most often in the same time period and often even place as the author. The realism isn't the point, though. It's about how the author constructed the setting and what they were trying to portray. You could write a work of literary fiction set in the 10th century, but not if it's really set in the mythical age of knights and chivalry or of swords and sorcery. A work of literary fiction set in the 10th century would probably examine a topical concern in a very personal way, working in that time period specifically to draw some contrast with today. There's a good chance that it would examine something related to identity. Perhaps it would focus on a peasant girl, as that's a perspective we don't really see much in either fantasy or in actual historical accounts. But more often, literary fiction is, again, set here and now, eschewing the expectations that go along with any particular genre. Elements of science fiction and fantasy may appear, but they won't be taken for granted as literary tropes. The designation of literary fiction is also very subjective, and cultural trends at the time can be relevant to whether it's considered literary fiction or not. A work focusing on the perspective of an underrepresented identity might be seen as literary fiction, while a very similar book, but from the perspective of an overrepresented identity, might not be. This isn't about hitting a diversity quota or anything like that, but about finding works that convey a unique human experience in a way that's universally relatable. That's primarily what we mean when we say that something is literary fiction, but hidden within this category is a general sense of class or literariness, which is key to everything I'm laboring to talk about here. So I think it's safe to say that The Lord of the Rings and The Wheel of Time are genre fiction, not literary fiction. But in terms of literariness, they're both very potent. Tolkien had an academic interest in mythology and linguistics, which he applied throughout his writing. Jordan likewise pulled deeply from the stories of King Arthur, the White Goddess, and various religions. Both Jordan and Tolkien paid great attention to historical realism, even within a fantasy setting. I'm not just talking about informative notes on things like blacksmithing, which are interesting but aren't really woven into the world. I mean, for example, that both Tolkien and Jordan did the math for how long it takes a group of people to travel on foot, on horse, in a small group, or with a large army. They considered the population for each region in the worlds they created. Jordan, in particular, paid very close attention to fashion trends for pretty much every culture he portrayed, and they even changed as the books went on in a way that felt very realistic to me. Beyond the world building, the prose itself is also artfully worked. Poetic imagery and rich layers of symbolism abound in both works. Just look at the sort of fan art that The Lord of the Rings inspires. Much of it is basically just natural imagery. The Lord of the Rings is as much about walking on a road under the shade of trees as it is about magic rings and evil goblins. If you condense The Lord of the Rings down to just its supernatural elements, the orcs, elves, dwarves, and wizards, then it doesn't really feel that much like The Lord of the Rings at all. There's sort of a timeless beauty to it. So what do we call this quality? There are plenty of fantastic books out there that don't really worry about this kind of craftsmanship. I love Salvatore's Drizzt books, and I love Kenzaka's Slayers. But if you compare either of those with The Lord of the Rings or The Wheel of Time, there's clearly something different. And I do not think this boils down to just better versus worse, or more serious versus less serious. The internet is probably filled with people that would disagree with me here, arguing that in so many words, the best books are those that are nearly impossible to interpret and are an absolute chore to read. Or, slightly more charitably, that timelessness, academic reference, and beauty of prose are what defines goodness in a book. This is the sort of reasoning that forgives the elves, dwarves, goblins, and wizards in The Lord of the Rings solely because they reference mythology. Sadly, this isn't merely limited to internet tryhards. It's baked into the entire history of how we reason about literature, going back to core issues of classism in academia. Bear in mind that the word classics refers specifically to class. Go try to read the writings of people like Derrida and Saussure sometime and note that they were, frankly, kind of terrible at actually communicating their ideas, at least to a general audience. I don't mean to say they didn't have really, really good ideas, but like most figures of literary theory, philosophy, and really academia as a whole, they seem to take pleasure in obfuscating their writing, caring more about poetry, mystery, and ego, sounding smart, than about actually explaining things well. This is something you'll come across in most academic circles as a sort of hazing ritual. Ideas are explained so poorly that coming to understand them becomes a badge of pride. Students of the field who win this badge then continue to propagate the poor teaching technique. Of course, I'm being a little bit glib here, but I really do find it frustrating that so many of our best ideas simply haven't been translated into an accessible form. But the simple fact of it, more true than any comments on ego, is that communicating with the intent to teach is actually a very difficult skill, and we don't really value it in academia, and we often assume that people have that skill just because they have a different, completely unrelated skill. I've seen personally, for example, that this actually happens a lot less in books in applied fields, where books and essays are written with the intent to sell them to working professionals, who will demand both a good idea and a good teacher. As a person with degrees in both computer science and Japanese language and literature, I'm telling you, I have had much better luck with the readability of books on algorithms than on books about literature. Even a fairly academic book, like Structure and Interpretation of Computer Programs, is actually surprisingly accessible when compared to something like Structure, Sign, and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences. You could go pick up a particularly good book on programming, like Land of Lisp, and have your first program working in just like an hour or so. I have a hard time believing that this is because writing code makes you better at communicating than critiquing literature. Rather, it's about the intent. Sacrificing accessibility for beauty, precision, and brevity is a perfectly reasonable trade when your audience expects it, but it isn't the sole mark of goodness. The reason I'm going on for so long in what is really supposed to be, and I promise will be, a discussion on Mage Errant by John Bierce, is that we really need to take care to see and respect the dimensions of accessibility and beauty for what they truly are. The Lord of the Rings and the Wheel of Time are both good to a great extent because of their subtle beauty, complex references to mythology, and gentle layering of symbolism. But to say that therefore a good fantasy series must be good because of subtle beauty, complex reference to mythology, and gentle layering of symbolism would be like saying that we loved last night's sushi so much that we're going to have tonight's chicken raw. So, just in case this rant got a little bit away from me, all I'm really saying is that there are a lot of ways for a book to be good, and we should take care not to overprivilege classical forms or get too hung up on genre. Everything we're talking about here is intensely subjective. Descriptions and critique, very much including everything I talk about on this channel, are only as true or as useful as you personally find them. Take what you like, consider what you hate, and ignore what you know to be wrong. I'm going to be here, talking about computer science, philosophy, hobbits, dragons, and anime ninjas all in the same breath because it's all good or bad on its own merit, not based on which arbitrary category it belongs in or whether it was part of high-class education 100 years ago. And this brings us, finally, and in all sincerity, to Mage Errant. Okay, so the tangent's over. My point here is really just that while Mage Errant is a light, pleasant read that pulls more from shonen anime than from the classics, it actually has a lot to say. Though it has magic and dragons, in terms of intent, I'd say it's got about as much sci-fi as fantasy. Bierce has some opinions on how power is aggregated, and Mage Errant is about our society as much as about Hugh and his friends. If you want something to compare it to, it's basically Naruto, but with more social commentary, a harder magic system, and more diversity. I mean, it's really pretty similar to Naruto, especially at the start. A few people have told me that Mage Errant takes a lot of inspiration from Cradle, but I haven't read Cradle. And if that's true, then Cradle must just be like the novelization of Naruto. Maybe with a little bit of Bleach thrown in. Maybe I'll have to give Cradle a try. I don't know. It sounds interesting, but of course, I'm being a little bit glib here. These are all works that pull from the same collection of Shinjia sources, originally about immortal heroes of Chinese mythology, but finding a surge of recent popularity in Japanese anime and light novels and in Western cultivation novels. Though I'm hardly an expert on Chinese literature, and yes, Chinese and Japanese literature are actually really different, probably surprisingly different if you're not familiar with either. They share some ancient themes in common, but you really have to go back like 1,000 years before there's too much overlap between them. Anything more recent than that is actually going to be very different. But just based on my familiarity with anime, I'd say that Mage Errant pulls more from anime than from other forms of this genre. Anyways, I'll get into specifics more after I open things up for spoilers, but if you like shonen anime, you'll probably like Mage Errant. The obvious standout feature of Mage Errant is the magic system. Again, I'm not going to spoil the details quite yet in this section, but the magic system is good. It's really good. It would make an excellent basis for a role-playing campaign, whether using something like GURPS or just homebrewing any other system. I've been playing and DMing D&D 5e, Mongooses Traveler, and Morkborg lately, like the last few years, and It'll be pretty easy to adapt any of these systems for a Mage Errant campaign, either by rigorously creating new spells and classes, or, and this is always my recommendation when playing D&D, just keep the rules loose and give the group room to kind of work with the creative metaphysics in Mage Errant. Mage Errant systems manage to be rich, imaginative, flexible, and consistent, while also having one foot firmly planted in real-world physics and chemistry. Bierce does an excellent job of striking a good balance here to keep things fun. You're not going to keep Wikipedia open just to understand what's going on, but if you've dabbled in chemistry, physics, biology, or geology, you're going to have plenty of opportunities to feel clever for understanding the mechanics of how something works. But even more than the magic system, I really like the social commentary. Bierce uses the world he creates to form some pretty compelling analogies to critique aspects of real-world politics, economics, and religion. I was really impressed at how illustrative these comparisons are, and how they're portrayed through the eyes of our characters. Again, this isn't an isekai story. Our prospective characters don't have knowledge of our real world, but that very lack of knowledge is used to compare and contrast, for example, tyrannical beings of overwhelming magical power and entities like nation-states and corporations. I also want to point out that Bierce's approach towards diversity and representation is some of the best, most naturally inclusive that I have ever read. We have gay, bi, trans, and non-binary characters who simply are. I don't mean to say that there isn't a place in fiction for works that actually highlight the struggles of any identity, but it really felt good to read something this wholly optimistic towards diversity. GSRM characters express their individuality without being defined solely by it. This isn't, for example, Mass Effect Andromeda, so desperate to be seen as progressive that it winds up actually kind of coming off as bewilderingly regressive. I particularly like the inclusion of an MB character who presents as relatively masculine. Maybe it's just the media I choose to consume, but it seems that pretty much every MB character I encounter is either androgynous or outright femme. Shimmering Cardivan isn't a major character, but they're easily my favorite side character in the series. I want to be Shimmering Cardivan when I grow up. Bierce also does just an incredible job of dealing with depression and social anxiety, both in the presentation and in how other characters respond to it. I really love how supportive and empathetic most of Bierce's characters are to one another. I want to see more books written like this. There's still plenty of drama. Bierce's characters aren't perfect or boring. They get emotional, make mistakes, and then either dig in or overly regret them, making things even worse. But when friends step in to help one another, they're actually good at it. I've never really realized how rare this is in fiction until I read Mage Errant. I really want my relationships with my friends and with my loved ones to be more like these. Anyways, I'm going to open things up for spoilers now. If you haven't read Mage Errant yet, but what I've said so far has got you interested, then I recommend stopping the video and picking up the first book. It's a pretty quick read. Here, it's this thick. And if you do stop watching here, let me know in a comment if you appreciated having a no spoiler section before I got more into details. I'm kind of trying out a new format here, and I'm not actually sure if anyone's going to find this useful or if it's just going to be kind of annoying that I split things up like this. All right, let's get a little more specific here. First off, seriously, Mage Errant really is Naruto. This isn't a bad thing at all. I liked Naruto when I was a teenager, and I'm constantly surprised to see that much younger people are still into it today. Like, are you all watching the original show or the sequels? But I would think it's too dated these days, but I guess I was watching stuff like Super Dimensional Fortress Macross when I was that age, so maybe that's just how things go. But anyways, let's break it down. Naruto is an orphan who, when we first meet him, struggles terribly with his ninja classes. We later discover that this is because he has too much chakra, due to the connection he shared with a demon, and he basically can't help but flood his ninja forms with too much chakra. With control, his unusually large chakra reserves become a great strength for him, and in fact he gains more control from having to struggle with it. But this requires some unorthodox teaching from a couple of eccentric teachers. As the series goes on, Naruto also forms a pact with a powerful magical creature, and he comes to grow an affinity for a certain element. The strongest similarity isn't even really about the details, but about the overall narrative structure. I really liked Last Echo. Reading Mage Errant just after the Wheel of Time, it's hard not to compare the battle in Havath with the various battles in the Wheel of Time, most notably the last battle, which I did a very long analysis of. Though Bierce enjoys an element of real physics in his magic system, he's not nearly as concerned with realism in the flow of battle, but that's okay. A realistic battle is confusing and chaotic. No one person, even a general, is going to follow the whole thing on every level. I really liked seeing this in the second battle of Kyrian, Dumai's Wells, and the last battle, but I'll admit, the destruction of Hamath was kind of more engaging moment to moment. I'm not even saying that Bierce's battles don't make sense in universe, just that the rules Bierce built for Mage Errant, for Anastas, result in more narratively engaging battles with a strong focus on individuals and their powers, rather than on armies. I really like seeing this. A complaint I often have about books, movies, and video games is that the creator wanted things to flow a certain way, but they didn't feel compelled to take the time to make it actually make sense. The teleporting armies in the last season of Game of Thrones is a good example of this. It's already a fantasy universe. You can come up with an in-universe reason for an army to get where it needs to be, or just go back and do some revisions. There's really no excuse for hand-waving something when you could, in-universe, just say that a wizard did it. Like, that still wouldn't be very satisfying, but it would be better than just hoping the audience doesn't notice. I really get the impression that Bierce was intentional about the type of story he wanted to tell here. He wanted to focus on character growth and dialogue. He wanted a lot of very complex magic fights, and he also wanted large battles between states. You can't really do this with a realistic setting in any time period, or even with a low fantasy medieval world. A shonen anime setting is just perfect for this. I mean, maybe I'm overthinking it, and Bierce just watches a lot of anime and wrote what he knows, but it just works so damn well that I think it's fair to read volition into this decision. The result of all of this is that the main battles at Ethos, Skyhold, and Havath feel realistic in-universe and compelling as large battles, but we, as readers, experience them as a series of small-scale battles between just a handful of individuals, allowing us to focus on the amazing powers they display and their inner thoughts. Niana Everflame and Lorna of the Vault's death scenes are great examples of this. In both scenes, we get plenty of characterization, inner thoughts, and some really fascinating bits of magic and world building. Niana even gets some very anime flashbacks. It would stretch belief to fit this into a more realistic battle, but in Mage Errant, it's perfectly natural. That's just how battles happen in a world with magic like this. Actually, it kind of works better in this form than it even does in anime. Like, go rewatch the first major arc of Naruto with Haku and Zabuza. That fight really feels like it drags on for just entirely too long. And is Sakura really just standing there for like 5 episodes in a row while everyone else talks, has flashbacks, and shows off their powers? Like, the flow in Mage Errant is frankly more anime than anime, and it works really well. Thankfully, Bierce didn't go full tournament arc, though the fight with Heliothrax does get kind of close. Actually, Heliothrax probably has more in common with Frieza than any Naruto character. She even has multiple forms. The more I think about this, the more I hope Mage Errant gets its own anime adaptation. Bierce, if you're watching, go make Mage Errant into an anime. Like, I know you're working on another series of books, but wouldn't it be easier to write it from like a throne made of money? Just give it a shot. I'll watch it. A lot of people would watch it. Anyways, the similarities between Mage Errant and Naruto break down more and more as the books go on, particularly the similarity between Hugh and Naruto as individuals, but there's still a lot there. Though really, the most interesting aspect of this to me is where Bierce differs from Naruto on a couple of key points. So Naruto and Hugh are both depressed and insecure when we first meet them. They're outcasts and they're losers, but they present this entirely differently. Part of the reason I like Naruto so much when I was a kid is that at the time, I responded to my own issues in a very similar manner. I would act out, play a fool, and be obnoxious, trying to own my anxiety by leaning into it until it no longer felt as though it applied to me. Even now, I retain a tendency to habitually do exactly that which I'm afraid to do. Given how loudly and frequently I speak out, people are often surprised to learn how much anxiety I have over public speaking. The idea of actually filming myself talking and publishing it on the internet is terrifying to me. So, of course, that's what I'm choosing to do with my time now. Like, you can probably tell just how many edit and like cuts I make in this. I'm not even making huge mistakes. I just really obsess about the smallest mistake in my speaking. So I often do 4 or 5 takes of the same paragraph because I got like one word wrong. And then I finally am just like, fine, screw it. Just keep this in the video, even though I still flub the pronunciation of one word. Like, that's... You wouldn't care. I see other videos that make way more speaking mistakes than I do. I should just leave them in, but again, I can't. So I'm going to continue to chop this up until it actually is worse because of all the edits that I have. As I've grown up, I no longer play the fool nearly as much, but as a kid, I definitely fell into the childishness of feeling that being called a fool wouldn't hurt if I was doing it on purpose. Naruto is exactly the same way. He does ridiculous, foolish, embarrassing things specifically so that any insults that come his way can be brushed aside. They're not really insulting me because I was just pretending. Hugh, on the other hand, withdraws. He hides in his room and doesn't speak when he's forced to come out. Though this isn't at all how I act when I'm struggling, it's exactly how some of my loved ones act. Learning that some people respond to pain with silence is something that took me an embarrassingly long time to learn just as a person. Bierce did an absolutely amazing job of writing Hugh realistically, then showing how to slowly help him out of it. I particularly like that Hugh's problems don't simply vanish once he finds some power. It's not some temporary flaw that can be smoothed over with a bit of confidence, but it's a part of his personality that he's always going to carry with him. Moreover, it's not just Hugh who learns to deal with this. Throughout the series, both Hugh and his friends learn how to deal with Hugh and his issues. The patience and empathy Hugh's friends show him, along with the persistence that Hugh himself brings in continuing to struggle against his limitations, is just remarkably well done. This is the sort of thing I was getting at with that long tangent about genre and literariness before. Hugh isn't woven together from mythical figures like Rand or Gandalf, but he's frankly a much more believable character and much more applicable to everyday life. Hugh is, in my opinion, simply a more useful character than any character in The Lord of the Rings or The Wheel of Time. Whether you yourself relate to Hugh, or whether, like me, you kind of don't, his perspective is invaluable. They should assign this series in school. Like, actually. We really see this with all the characters. In most fantasy stories, characters are larger than life in both their strengths and weaknesses. A fantasy hero is just better than a real person, yet we'll completely forgive things that would be a deal breaker for us in a real friend. It's only fairly recently that we've stopped giving fantasy heroes a free pass on pretty horrific sex crimes, and we still generally look the other way when they slaughter their way through situations that they could have handled peacefully. In Mage Errant, our characters are actually pretty normal in terms of strengths and weaknesses, magic powers aside. They do bad things, but they recognize these things as bad in universe. Hugh never breaks his habit of vomiting after killing someone, even in battle. Sabe makes an ass of herself the first time she tries flirting, but no more or less than an average person might. That Sabe, Talia, and Godric are more comfortable with killing than Hugh isn't just taken for granted. They were raised to be more or less okay with this, and they occasionally confront this reality for what it is. As I mentioned before, where our heroes in Mage Errant are larger than life is in how they resolve conflict and make up for their flaws. Sabe recognizes that she's been raised to be ruthless and heartless by a power-hungry dynasty, and she wants to use her power to do something about it. When Hugh and Talia have a fight, Talia does a great job of trying to fix it, and Hugh responds healthily to that. Characters even learn virtues from one another. Hugh never had any real taste for vengeance to begin with, and Godric takes this lesson to heart. Really note here that Godric learned this lesson, which is often the sort of thing that a character would learn firsthand, by just observing and admiring his friend. Our characters help each other with their weaknesses, share their strengths, and try to learn to be as good as one another. This is practically the opposite of how fantasy heroes often work. It's much healthier and also more relatable, and Bierce manages to make it just as dramatic and entertaining too. I also want to just briefly point out that Mage Errant's characters are just really memorable and likable. Their specific powers and distinct appearances really stand out, reminding me a lot of how anime and video game characters are generally made to be recognizable from just a silhouette and color pattern and maybe some unique characteristic. We even had an adorable mascot character in Mackerel. As someone who's had a lot of pets and has a roughly year-old puppy right now, you can really tell that Bierce based Mackerel on some real pets. My puppy, Radagast, has just taken to destroying CPAP masks lately. Like, he got 3 before we managed to figure out how to stop him. At least he hasn't developed a taste for books, because we have a ton of books on shelves that are within his reach. Like, I'm just hoping he never realizes that if he opens up the cover, there's a whole bunch of delicious paper in there. Like, he loves other paper. For some reason, he just hasn't learned that there's paper hidden inside of books. Anyways, I generally prefer to focus more on themes and references than on just geeking out over likable characters, but Mage Errant really does have some great characters. I'm actually surprised at how hard some of the minor character deaths for people like Larna and Niana hit me. Hugh, Sabe, Talia, and Godric are all fantastic, but Artur and especially Alustin were really masterfully done. I particularly like how hard it is to neatly classify Alustin. There's just a ton of depth to his character, and it all felt very real to me. The other divergent parallel with Naruto that I found noticeable is the concept of a natural genius versus a genius of persistence. In Naruto, we see this play out early on between Naruto and Sasuke. Sasuke is simply better than nearly everyone else. He didn't earn it, it's just his superior genetics. He still works hard, but he's naturally gifted. Naruto, at least early, before like 6 years after the show started airing, they retconned in a bunch of Uzumaki bloodline stuff in, but Naruto, and even more so Rock Lee, have to struggle just to be average. Yet their capacity for struggling is absolutely immense. It's kind of a nice idea, as there's sort of a balance here. Natural talent is great, but if you lack any obvious talent, maybe your real talent is in learning, working hard, or being a jack of all trades. Bierce's approach here is similar, but a bit more realistic, weaving in his social commentary. Hugh, Talia, and Sabe begin the series struggling just to be average, and they do work very hard to overcome their weaknesses and even spin them into unique strengths. But Sabe is very explicit in explaining that this isn't just a matter of hard work. They benefited massively from all the support and investment they received. Hard work alone simply couldn't have bridged the gap between Hugh and Rhodes. Even with that support, when we finally see Rhodes again as the Frost Ghost, we see that he's still more than a match for any of our characters one-on-one. In addition to being of privileged birth and natural talent, of course, he's also a hard worker. Where Hugh and his friends manage to set themselves apart is in their creativity and some of the risks that they take. While Rhodes has grown more powerful and begun to build a reputation as a vigilante, Hugh and his friends have visited other worlds and performed several feats of new creative magic. So we see that hard work, teamwork, and ingenuity do matter, but only when properly funded. Sabe comments on this explicitly, wondering how many other talented people were unable to make a difference simply because they lacked the initial investment. This is a very topical point for much of the world right now. If we can afford to invest in people who lack the means to thrive, shouldn't we? How many geniuses out there are we missing out on out of a fear that the investment might not pay off, or that it might not be fair to allocate resources to people who haven't managed to earn them yet? Hugh didn't earn Kandarin's support when he got it, but it sure seems like that investment is going to pay out with remarkable growth. Which brings us away from referencing things in terms of Naruto and more towards discussing Bierce's social commentary directly, which I found to be absolutely amazing. Again, this is why I spent so much time rambling about genre and literariness before. Bierce's Mage Errant is, frankly, better as social commentary than even some of, for example, Ursula Le Guin's work. To be clear, I don't mean to say that her work isn't excellent, just that Bierce's is also excellent, maybe even better. The whole system of great powers is a fantastic analogy for greedy, pyramid-shaped social systems like manorialism and capitalism. The term great power isn't even a metonym. It's literally used in almost the exact same way as we use it in our world. Taken from the first line of the Wikipedia page, quote, "A great power is a sovereign state that is recognized as having the ability and expertise to exert its influence on a global scale." The only difference between the great powers of Anastas and of Earth is that power on that scale on Earth is only possible via the accumulation of social power, money, and legitimacy. Bierce even highlights this difference by showing us that whereas Sabe's Candace is a family dynasty built on legitimacy born of magical might directly, Rhodes' Highvale is feudal, and Indris rules Theris Tel more through wealth than by being a powerful dragon. Godric even goes even further, thinking to himself, hereditary great powers like Sabe's family were ruthless enough. Hereditary nobles who pretended that the right to the position came from anything other than simple power, though, they would stoop to any depth to maintain that status. With Demetrius, we see a world where the rules of magic are very different, where individuals cannot amass power as easily as on Anastas, not individually. Demetrius's paper rune magic system limits the magical power an individual can wield at any time, but also makes it trivial to aggregate the person hours of many people into great suits of armor. Though Anastas's great powers are very much like those on Earth, Demetrius is even more relatable to us, as powerful individuals draw their might from the collective effort of many, many people. Hundreds or thousands of years of labor, harvested from the efforts of the powerless, all aggregated into a single person's armor. It's striking to me how similar the scene of people in Demetrius working on sheets of runed paper would be to a village of farmers, woodcutters, charcoal burners, and blacksmiths, all toiling to produce metal armor and weapons for their rulers. Most poignantly, our characters recognize that, though the ability of an individual from Demetrius to wield magical power is much less than that of someone from Anastas, the rules of Demetrius could easily conquer Anastas anyways, as the aggregation of power across the population is simply too great, even when diminished on an individual level, than that an individual can come on with on their own. There's little poetic ambiguity here. The power a state or corporation can muster from its population or employees is simply too much for individuals to contend with. Even if Sabe comes up with a solution to the problem of great powers, there is no guarantee that it would generalize to the problem of empire. By the end of Mage Errant, the only sure solution we found to empire is Kandran herself, a tyrant who we can only hope to be better than the alternative. Yet, there are other options. Kandran aims to preserve limited regions with liches, individuals with a personal stake in enriching a region. Meanwhile, Ilenia plans to preserve her dynasty, which has grown too great to be inherited by any individual, by splitting off some of the power into others. What I really love here is that, while Bierce can't offer us a blueprint to fix society, he has given us some excellent analogies to illustrate the problems, with Sabe serving to explain or call attention to any details that might be lost while reading. The philosophical concepts here are pretty deep and important, and they really are best explained with some analogies on hand. So this is excellent as just a learning tool for understanding how societies function and what the major problems are. The ultimate problem is in ensuring that society is led well. Plato envisioned a society which intentionally produces a philosopher king, trained in virtue as well as matters of state and philosophy. Of course, the problem there is that no proposed system to produce a series of unerringly ethical philosopher kings actually works, all falling prey to more or less the same issues called out by Plato and his contemporaries, and still unsolved today. Those of us living in democracies today look back on feudalism and manorialism with well-earned scorn, but inherited family stewardship of a region actually has some success in giving leaders a reason to care about the success of their rule. A good king or queen, and the word good there does matter, will very likely outperform a democracy in some ways. And if you teach a person from childhood that their purpose is to preserve a region and the people who live there, then there's at least a chance that they're actually going to take it to heart. A wise and empathetic king or queen may actually be less prone to the sort of apathy and majority bias that constantly eat at democracies. The inequality we see today in some capitalist democracies, such as the United States, is actually worse than in some manorialist societies in the past, only really finding historical competition in slave states and empires with non-free enslaved classes. This isn't to say that we should go back to manorialism. There's very little protection against bad rulers. There's a reason that society mostly has moved on from that. But even a good change, like adopting democracy, is often 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Bierce's conception of liches is reminiscent of the Fisher King, whose personal health is tied to that of the land he rules. A ruler who truly sees the land as an extension of their body would, I would think, be more inclined toward taking good care of it. Yet, Bierce also makes it clear that this isn't a perfect solution either. Liches come to dissociate from ephemerals over time, and it's only Kandran's careful appointment of individuals that ensures the liches she creates are good leaders. If you've played any of Genshin Impact, you might actually recognize a very similar theme for the gods of Teyvat. Even if you somehow solve the problem of producing a good philosopher king and then make them immortal, there's simply no way to ensure that they'll remain good indefinitely. As times change, leadership must change too. The definition of good in a ruler is not static. There's no perfect answer here, which is why Kandran approaches the problem from multiple angles, treating each solution as just one of many, which is also an excellent lesson here. Sabe isn't going to find a single solution to society's problems, but that needn't stop her from trying to move things in a better direction. The worst solution of all is to do nothing, to simply accept the status quo or to give in to the fear that change may be disruptive and fail to do anything at all. A few of my friends and I used to run a reading and political debate group on Discord, and a problem we repeatedly encountered, like almost every week, was that it is simply not possible to come up with a complete plan to supplant all of society's rules, changing everything monotonically for the better, and with a perfect plan to adopt this new system that no one would oppose. Improving the world necessarily requires a degree of trial and error and of compromise. The failure of one attempt at change doesn't prove that change is bad, just that attempt was flawed, or even that it was a perfectly fine attempt, but it was thwarted by those who prefer the status quo. Sometimes, if you want to save the world, you might also need to make someone late for work or make a little bit of noise outside. I really like the multiple methods of divesting power we see between Kandran's liches and Ilenia's warlocks. In a democracy, we think of spreading out power by vote, but in feudal systems, power is divided among people. History is filled with examples of rulers who succeeded in consolidating their rule in life, only to fail in passing it on to a worthy successor. If you want another good, practical lesson on this topic, go play some Crusader Kings. Greedily grabbing up all the land you can will often fail even within a single ruler's life. But even if you manage to get one ruler that actually pulls it off, the odds are that their heir is probably not going to pick it up seamlessly. In many cases, it's actually better to give some of that power away, but give it to someone you trust and who trusts you. I don't want to go too deep here, but This is where the distinction between hegemony is a handy thing to be familiar with. You don't need to directly rule a place to retain a degree of authority over it. Things like trade, treaty, trust, and threat of violence can give one state authority over another without requiring the burden of governance. In all of time, there's probably no better example of this than the United States today. The US doesn't need to convert other countries into colonies or states to exercise power over them. It is much cheaper to control the region through other means, reaping the rewards of empire without incurring the costs. From the ruler's perspective, this is all still completely selfish. Elenia isn't giving up even one bit of the Stormseat's power out of selflessness, but out of necessity. Kandrin may have good intentions, but you can't separate away the fact that she's building immortal allies who can't move on her territory, who probably have backdoors built into their domains, and who feel indebted to her. The great powers of Anastas may not like traditional forms of empire, but through hegemony, they accomplish a very similar effect. Ultimately, what I like here is how thinking this all through applies very directly to politics in real life without giving the illusion of any easy answers. This isn't just useful for teenagers who might be encountering these ideas for the first time, but for anyone. I've studied a fair bit of poli-sci and history myself, and I'm certainly familiar with the topics here, but Bierce has given me some new perspectives to look at things from. With Sabe, we're also given a bit of that fantasy inspiration in the form of her resolve to do just something to help. You don't need to have all the answers to be an activist. You just need to have good intentions and a sincere willingness to try your best and to move things in the right direction. Things might not always go your way, and you might even make things worse on occasion, but the same is true for even the great powers. Oh, also, I think it is absolutely hilarious that Heliothrax literally gains power through hostile acquisitions. As in many acquisitions, she only really is interested in the brands, the affinities, and she, let's say, lays off the sapiency of the actual workers she acquires. Back when I was at Microsoft, the company did the exact same thing to Nokia. The comments on religion in Mage Errant aren't as deep as everything else I've talked about here, but I feel like I still need to call out the point about invisible cults. I really like this idea that in a world where godlike beings take a direct role in the events of day-to-day life, the overwhelming majority of cults worship specific beings that they know to be real, and conflicts between cults are very practical. So in a world like this, would there be any place for religion like that in our world? In Ethos, these are called invisible cults, and they're considered very strange. To some extent, this is similar to the distinction between monotheism and polytheism. Though cults and polytheism don't actually know their gods, they do see limited direct roles for each god. Worshipping a god in a polytheist religion often isn't about saving your soul or anything as spiritual and mysterious as that. It's generally about getting that god's help with a specific thing. We don't really see the specifics, but I imagine that worshipping a great power is similar. After all, nobody thinks that Indris, for example, is omnipotent or rules over the dead. I imagine that the average supplicant to Indris wants something specific, maybe even as mundane as a loan or water. In a world where the gods are real and where begging them for help actually works, so long as they consent to it, a cult to an invisible god would seem very strange indeed, no different from Russell's teapot, the flying spaghetti monster, or the invisible pink unicorn. I don't really see this as an attack on religion or even really any specific political point from Bierce. Rather, I think the comments on invisible cults versus great power cults are really just an interesting way to look at some things from our real world from the perspective of someone who would find it completely alien. All right, so that's pretty much just a long stream of glowing praise so far. So let me just talk about one thing I didn't particularly like. Now, I really like Mage Errant, not just as a story, but as a world, and I'd like to see more stories in this world. I also like our characters, and I'd like to see more of them. Really, just more Bierce would be good too. But I felt the bits of franchise building in the last couple of books felt really jarring. I loved the jaunt through the labyrinth into other worlds, and the vague sense that there's more to the world than they just saw at Skyhold. So I guess what I'm really talking about here is specifically the ending to the last book. I really feel like the series should have just left off without Chapter 76, where Kandrin just outright says that she wants Hugh and his friends to train to become named so she won't lose him to mortality. Along the way, she also explains a bit about the difference between named, ascendants, endlings, and uniques. Then she sends Hugh and his friends off to start their multiversal training. So just think through the different possibilities here. I'm not saying that this shouldn't happen in the story, but I am saying that it shouldn't have come at the very end of the series like it did. Imagine if the series had left off exactly as it did, but without the conversation about training to become named and without the bit where we get the explicit confirmation that Alustin is still alive and will continue to work for Kandrin. we'd still get a little hint that Alustin was probably alive, as Hugh felt a little bit of planar magic just before he died. We'd still know from their time on Limnus that multiversal training is an option, and we know from the small glimpses of some other powerful beings like the Lyre that there's still plenty of room for Hugh and his friends to grow. But without those scenes, we'd be left to imagine how that would go. If we never see these characters again, then we're free to imagine anything we want. If we do see them again, then either just make another direct sequel picking up in this same scene at the first part of the next book, or have them show up after a time skip or as characters in another series having already accomplished at least some of this training. Like, maybe I'm being a little too nitpicky here, but this really just felt like the most boring way to end the series, just telling us they're going to go train. I mean, what happens next? Either the training goes fine and they become named uneventfully, or what? Something goes wrong during the training? Why not just leave this ambiguous? Of course they were going to keep getting stronger. They were able to travel between worlds and deep into labyrinths even before the group packed. At the very least, they'd want to go find some more treasure in the labyrinths now that they know that Mackerel can just find all the valuable items in every labyrinth. There are just so many ways things could go, but no, Mage Errant was just high school, and now that they've graduated, they're going straight into college without any break. Like, at least let me pretend they get a semester off or something. It just felt like the perfect worst blend of too much and too little information. Same with Alustin. Just give us Hugh's little comment about planar magic. That would have been enough for us to know that Kandran probably kept Alustin alive. We know that she had kind of similar motherly feelings about Alustin as she has for Hugh, and she wants to keep him alive. But just don't tell us that he's not only alive, but also he's just going to keep working for her in a different capacity. Like, leave it ambiguous, and then if we find out later on, that's fine. Just leave a gap there and we can fill it in our heads, or put some short stories up on Patreon. Which is really what I guess kind of happened here, is that Bierce has some definite plans for the future of the Etheread, and he wants to set it up for readers who aren't catching his Patreon short stories. So I do wonder if this little bit right here was originally going to be on Patreon, and then he thought, well, no, I should make sure everyone gets this because it sets up kind of the ending. It wouldn't seem fair to give that only to people on Patreon. But I don't know, I didn't like it at the end of the book. Maybe that's just me. Anyways, as far as complaints go, this is really very, very mild, and it hardly detracts from the series at all. But it just felt to me like Bierce kind of tripped through the finish line. Like, he still won the race, but it could have gone a little bit more gracefully. All right, so my last comment on Mage Errant is that I really liked seeing how Bierce grew, both intransitively as an author and transitively the Etheread throughout the series. And I think there are some things here for aspiring authors to focus on. On Kindle, Into the Labyrinth is just 216 pages, while The Last Echo of the Lord of Bells is 816. The scope of the world and what's going on grows steadily and very reasonably throughout the series, starting with very limited concerns like passing the first test and dealing with Picori, and growing into massive conflicts between factions. The rules of magic continue to grow as our characters grow. This all feels entirely natural as it happens. Focusing on students helps to guide the narrative, as we can learn about magic as our characters do. Being from Emblem, Hugh doesn't really know that much about magic, so it makes sense for him to occasionally need things explained to him. The only time this really felt jarring to me is there's one moment in, God, I don't remember, like book like 3 or 4 or something like that, where Hugh assumes that liches and Onastis work like they do in D&D. And it seems strange to me that people from Emblem would be so out of touch they wouldn't know at all what a lich is. Like, they don't really have magic, but they do have trade with other countries. I don't know why Hugh would think that liches are like undead, like skeletal mage. I don't know where he got that idea in his head. That felt like that was something the audience would think, and Bierce was explaining his liches, and I feel like it could have gone more smoothly, but that's literally the only time it all felt jarring to me, the way that we have our respective characters opening up the world in the entire series of books. So that's pretty damn good. I can only think of one example. As an exercise in writing, I think this is the major takeaway from Mage Errant. Don't see your world, characters, and story as things that exist separately from the story and narrative structure that you're working with. Mage Errant wouldn't have worked nearly as well if Hugh and his friends had started the series off as experienced librarians errant. How would we have been introduced to the way the world works? Of course, you don't always need to start with students or have a clueless perspective character from a place like Emblem. There are plenty of ways to tell a story, but always keep in mind that as an author, you can change anything about what you're writing at any time, and it's fine. there's nothing wrong with reshaping your characters, the world, or even the core details of the plot in order to fit the limitations of your narrative structure so that it actually flows well as a series. Okay, so that pretty much covers what I have to say about Mage Errant. Again, I really, really like this series. I mean, I figured I would at least enjoy it going in, but it surprised me just how good it is. Also, just in case Bierce actually watches this video, Bailey really, really liked the poster you sent after hearing about her diagnosis. She's got it framed in her office, and we really, really appreciate the gesture. Really, really cool move from an author. I have no personal connection to Bierce at all whatsoever, but that was a very nice thing of him to do. So apparently really nice guy too. All right, so next up, I'm planning to start on the Cosmere. Now, Bailey's treatment schedule is really intense right now, and it might change at literally any moment. So I'm not actually sure when I'll get the next video out, but I'm hoping that it won't be too long. Also, really, really hoping this doesn't get too expensive and force me to go back to work full time, because that's going to really slow things down, but we'll see how it goes. I'm also not sure exactly when I'm going to do the video about her cancer diagnosis and what we're all going through. Again, it's something I feel kind of obliged to do, as it's just an insane situation. And I think I actually can capture a lot of this into words. And I think that would be useful to somebody, either because it'd be similar to what they're going through, or just to any of you seeing this. Like, it's actually strange to me now thinking at how many different works I've seen where a character dealt with a major illness or with potentially losing a spouse. And looking at those now, I'm kind of like, wow, that doesn't feel at all like how I'm feeling about it. I don't think that person did their research. So, I mean, maybe, I guess people are all different, but in any case, I feel obliged to make the video. I'm going to make the video. I don't know when. It's very difficult to do, both in terms of just time and then also emotionally, that I want to kind of capture it correctly and do it justice. But I'll do it sometime. I'm also really not sure what format I'm going to use for the Cosmere videos yet. How did this video go? Like, let me know in a comment. Did you like having the spoiler-free section at the beginning before I went into spoilers? Did that feel natural? Like I was kind of splitting it up? Like for Wheel of Time, I kind of assumed that everybody watching it has probably read the Wheel of Time. But for Mage Errant, it's new enough and it's a little bit less known. I figured it'd be good to, split the video up for people that haven't seen it and want to learn about it, and then have a second section for either people that have already read it or for people that just don't care about spoilers. So let me know what you thought about that. Was any of that a waste? What did you think? I'm still playing with formats here. The format I hit in the Wheel of Time worked for the Wheel of Time, and I might apply the same format to the Cosmere, having sort of like a summary at the top and then breaking it down into larger subsections and then some final kind of quick comments. But I don't know if I'm going to use that for those. I might play around with it a little bit to see kind of how things work. Maybe I'll do some more like this. Let me know what formats you like or what you've liked so far that I've done or what you haven't liked. Because really feedback, I love positive feedback. Definitely give me praise. I love praise, but critical feedback, things that you don't like, is frankly more useful to me because then I know what not to do. So also, I just want to thank everybody. I really like all the comments and the subscriptions and all the support that I've got for this. Like, this is a very niche channel. I don't expect my subscriber number to explode overnight. I'll admit there's been a few times I've been looking up like Diablo 4 build videos and thinking, wow, I could apparently get like 500,000 views on a video of me just talking off the top of my head about a build that barely works in Diablo 4. Why am I working so hard to get like maybe 300 or 400 views for something that takes me weeks to write and produce and all that? But then I see all the great comments you guys write, and I compare those comments with the comments under those build videos, and it's totally worth it. I really love you guys. Thank you for the comments. Thank you for the support, and thanks for watching. And I hope you liked this. So until next time, I hope you enjoyed the video.